The silence came first, not the absence of noise, but the absence of the right noise. I was standing on the bridge of the storm rise, watching the tactical display, and the support fleet that should have lit up the screen in friendly blue simply was not there. 40 seconds. That was how long I stood frozen, counting down a window that should have been full of Allied ships and was instead full of nothing. Captain Voss, the Varathi fleet has not entered the relay point, said Daniel, my communications officer, his voice tight and careful, like a man trying not to spill something. Try the channel again, I said. He tried. Static answered him. Outside the viewport, the battle had already begun without our help arriving. The enemy ships, the Korvath, came through the dark like a wave breaking against rock, and we were the rock, alone, exactly where the Varathi fleet was supposed to be standing beside us. I had fought beside the Varathi for 3 years. I had eaten food made in their kitchens, learned 6 words of their language, watched their officers cry at funerals the same way we did. I believed, the way you believe in gravity, that they would be there when it mattered. They were not there. Incoming fire, shouted my weapons officer, a young woman named Lily who had only been on this ship for 4 months. Her hands moved fast over the console, faster than her training should have allowed, because fear teaches you things your instructors never could. The ship rocked, lights flickered. Somewhere below decks a hull breach alarm started screaming, and I made myself breathe before I gave the next order, because panic spreads from the top down, and I was the top. Hold formation, return fire. Daniel, get me anyone at all. He worked the console like his life depended on it, because it did. Every life on this ship depended on it. Nothing came back. No Varathi voice, no apology, no explanation. Just the cold mathematics of 3 human battle groups facing an enemy fleet built for 6. I want to tell you I knew right away what was happening. I did not. In that first hour, I told myself it was a malfunction, a relay failure, a mistake that someone would fix. I held on to that belief the way you hold on to a railing on a ship that is already sinking, because the alternative was too large to hold in my hands. The Korvath ships tore through our left flank in the first 20 minutes. I watched the Endeavour, a ship I had served on as a younger officer, take 3 direct hits and go dark on my display. 211 people. Gone, just like that, turned into a flat line on a screen I was forced to keep watching because looking away would not bring them back. Captain, the Mercy Bell is requesting permission to retreat, Daniel said. Denied, we hold. I gave that order because retreating without cover meant dying slower instead of dying faster, and I needed every gun we had pointed at the enemy, not running from it. But even as I said it, something cold moved through my chest, settling there like a stone dropped into still water. The Varathi were not coming. It was Lily who said it first, though she did not mean to. She said it the way people say true things by accident, when the fear strips away the careful words we use to protect ourselves from our own thoughts. They left us here, she whispered, not looking up from her console. They knew this fight was coming and they left us here. I should have corrected her. I should have said something about communication failures and the fog of war and all the comfortable lies that officers are trained to offer when the truth is too sharp to hand to a crew mid-battle. I did not say any of those things. I simply watched the tactical display, watched the gap where 600 friendly ships should have been, and I understood that Lily was right, and that I had known it for longer than I wanted to admit. The next 2 hours were the longest of my life, and I have lived through many long hours since. We fought because there was nothing else to do. Surrender was not offered to us, not by an enemy who saw humanity as raw material rather than a people. I watched my weapons crew fire until their boards overheated, watched the engineering deck reroute power from life support to weapons, because a ship with no guns is just a coffin with windows. I watched Daniel keep trying the Varathi channel every 4 minutes, like a man knocking on a door he was beginning to understand would never open. At the 2-hour mark, the Mercy Bell stopped answering hails. I did not need anyone to tell me what that meant. At the 2-hour and 40-minute mark, my second officer, a quiet man named Caleb who rarely spoke unless the situation demanded it, walked onto the bridge with blood on his uniform that was not his own, and reported that we had lost Engineering Deck 3. 12 crew. He said it the way you report weather, flat and even, because if he let any feeling into his voice, he would not have been able to keep functioning, and neither would the people listening to him. I do not remember making the decision to ram the lead Korvath cruiser with our forward shuttle bay, but the logs later showed that I gave that order, and that it worked, buying us 40 more minutes that allowed 11 other ships to escape the field. I do not remember it because by then my mind had narrowed down to a single sharp point, the way a river narrows into a canyon, all the wideness and softness of normal thought stripped away by the force of what was happening. We survived. The storm rise survived, barely, limping out of that battle with one engine dead and half the crew wounded, and 403 of the people I was responsible for did not survive at all. When the fighting finally stopped, when the Corvath fleet pulled back to lick its own wounds, I stood on the bridge and looked at the wreckage scattered across the display like broken teeth, and I thought about the Varathi ships that never came, and something in me that had been soft and trusting for 31 years simply closed, the way a door closes, quiet and final, and impossible to open again from the same side. Daniel finally got a connection through 3 hours after the battle ended, not to a Varathi command ship, to a relay station, automated, playing a pre-recorded message about a strategic redeployment that had been necessary for the protection of core coalition territories. I listened to that message twice. The first time I listened for information. The second time I listened for the lie inside it, and I found it easily, because once you know where to look, lies are not hard to find. They had known about the Corvath attack. They had chosen which fleets would meet it. They had chosen us. I walked through the ship that night, past the medical bay where Lily was helping bandage wounds with hands that still shook, past the crew quarters where people sat in small groups not talking, just being near each other, because being alone felt unsafe. I stopped at the memorial wall, the place where we would soon add 403 names, and I stood there for a long time without moving. A young engineer named Owen found me there. He had a burn across one side of his face, fresh enough that the medical patch was still glowing faintly blue. "Captain," he said, "is it true that they just left?" I could have lied to him. I could have given him the comfortable version, the version where this was confusion and not choice. I looked at his face, at the burn, at the exhaustion behind his eyes, and I decided that he had earned better than comfort. "Yes," I said, "it's true." He nodded slowly, like a man absorbing a blow he had already half expected. "What happens now?" he asked. I did not have an answer for him that night. What I had instead was work, the kind that does not wait for grief to finish, the kind that fills the hours so the mind does not have time to sit too long with what it has lost. I spent the next several hours moving through every deck of the Stormrise, because a captain who hides in her own quarters after a battle teaches her crew that hiding is permitted, and I needed them to see me standing. In the medical bay, I found a woman named Hannah holding the hand of a wounded gunner while a doctor worked on his leg. Hannah was not medical staff. She was a navigator, off-duty, sitting there because the man could not be alone, and someone needed to be present who was not also bleeding. I stayed in the doorway for a moment, watching how she kept her voice steady and low, telling him about a lake near her childhood home, anything to keep his mind from the pain, and I understood that this, too, was a kind of fighting. In engineering, I found Caleb directing repair crews with the same flat calm he had used to report the dead. He had not slept. None of us had slept. He showed me the damage to the third engine, the cracked housing that would need a full station repair we would not get for weeks, and he showed me the makeshift patch his team had built instead, something that should not have worked according to any manual, but did. "We'll hold," he said, not as a question, but as a fact he was choosing to believe into existence. "We'll hold," I agreed. I found Daniel still at his console long after his shift should have ended, running the recorded Varathi message over and over, not because he expected new information from it, but because he was searching for the exact moment the lie had been written, as if finding that moment would somehow make it smaller. "Go and rest," I told him. "I can't," he said. "Every time I close my eyes I hear the silence where their fleet should have been." I did not have a cure for that. I only had the same silence living in my own chest, and I told him so. And for a moment, neither of us said anything else, because some things do not need more words placed on top of them. It was near the end of that long, sleepless night that I returned to the memorial wall, and that was where Owen found me, and that was where I made him the promise I had not yet said out loud to anyone, the one I would carry for years. Standing there in the dim emergency lighting, surrounded by the wreckage of trust I had carried my whole career, I made myself a private promise, one I did not say out loud yet, one that would take years to become real. We would remember exactly who did not come. And one day we would make them understand precisely what that absence cost. The Battle of Cradlefall lasted 6 hours. It would take humanity 2 more years to win the war the Varathi abandoned us inside of. But it took only those 6 hours, only that one long silence where help should have been, to teach me the only lesson that would matter for everything that came after. Trust, once broken in war, does not heal. It transforms into something else entirely, something patient and exact, something that waits. I did not know yet what humanity would become in the years after Cradlefall. I only knew, standing at that memorial wall with Owen beside me, and the weight of 403 names pressing down on my chest, that we would not be the same people who had flown into that battle believing in allies who would never come. We would become something the galaxy had not seen before, and the Varathi, more than anyone, would learn exactly what that meant. 2 years after Cradlefall, I stood on a different bridge, commanding a different kind of fleet, and I watched my crew execute an order that would have made the woman I used to be feel sick. We were ending the siege of a Korvath shipyard called Greywatch, the largest weapons facility the enemy had left, and the old rules said you surround a target like this, demand surrender, give the defenders a path to walk away from. Those were Varathi rules. Coalition rules. The rules of an alliance that had taught us how to fight and then abandoned us the moment fighting actually cost something. We did not use those rules anymore. All batteries report ready, said Caleb, who was my second officer no longer. He commanded his own ship now, the Long Memory, flying in formation beside mine. We had both changed ranks in 2 years of war, both changed in other ways too, ways that did not show up on any uniform. Proceed, I said. The shipyard came apart in 11 minutes, no warning broadcast. No offer of surrender. We had learned, at terrible cost, that warnings only gave the enemy time to call for help that humanity would never receive in return, and so we stopped giving them. I felt nothing watching it happen. That absence of feeling frightened me more than grief ever had. After the battle, I held a debrief with my senior officers in the small conference room behind the bridge, the same kind of room where, 2 years earlier, we might have spent an hour discussing the ethics of a strike like this one. We did not discuss ethics anymore. We discussed efficiency, fuel reserves, and the location of the next target. Lily was there. No longer the young weapons officer with shaking hands, but a tactical commander in her own right, sharp-eyed and certain. She had been the one to identify Greywatch as a priority target 3 weeks earlier, and she had been right. The Varathi Council wants to schedule a call, said Hannah, who had moved from navigation into something closer to intelligence work, the kind of work that requires understanding people you no longer trust. They want to discuss coordination on the next offensive. The room went quiet in a particular way, the way a room goes quiet when everyone present is thinking the same thing and waiting to see who says it first. Coordination, Caleb repeated, the word flat in his mouth like something he did not want to taste. That's the word they used, Hannah said. I thought about the 6 hours at Cradlefall, the silence where 600 ships should have been, the 403 names on a wall that had since grown into thousands of names on memorials across a dozen worlds, because Cradlefall had not been the only time the Coalition's senior species found a reason to arrive late, or not at all, whenever the cost of arriving on time grew too high for their taste. Schedule the call, I said. I'll take it myself. The call happened the next day, and the Varathi representative who appeared on my screen was a diplomat named Elwyn Sarith, a presence I had spoken with twice before. Always polite, always smooth, always using language built to soften hard things into something easier to swallow. Captain Voss, she said, and her voice carried that same practiced warmth I remembered, untouched by anything that had happened in the years between. It is good to see you well. Your fleet's success at Greywatch has been noted with great appreciation by the Council. Appreciation, I said. Indeed, your people have shown remarkable resilience. I let that word sit in the silence for a moment. Resilience, as if what we had built in the ashes of Cradlefall was simply a personality trait, rather than the direct consequence of being left to die, and refusing to die anyway. We appreciate the recognition, I said, my voice giving nothing away. What does the Council require? We would like to discuss joint command of the next phase of operations. Your fleet has grown considerably. The Council believes a more structured chain of command would benefit all parties. There it was, dressed up in careful words, the same old shape underneath. The Varathi wanted control again, now that humanity's strength had become useful to them, now that the war was tilting in a direction they wanted credit for. I'll bring the request to my command council, I said, which was true, and which was also a way of saying no without saying it directly, a skill I had learned from watching the Varathi do exactly the same thing to us for years. Elwyn smiled, the same warm, practiced smile she always wore, and for a moment I studied her face the way you study a familiar painting, looking for the crack you know must be somewhere beneath the surface. Of course, she said. We trust your judgment. Trust. She used that word too, easily, without any apparent memory of what trust had once meant between our peoples, without any apparent understanding that the woman she was speaking to had stood at a memorial wall 2 years earlier, and made a private promise that this exact conversation was slowly fulfilling. After the call ended, I sat alone on the bridge for a long while, the lights dimmed to their evening setting, the hum of the ship around me the only sound. Daniel found me there, still my communications officer, though he too had changed in 2 years, grown quieter, more precise, a man who chose his words the way a surgeon chooses an instrument. They still don't see it, he said, sitting down beside me without being asked. A familiarity earned through years of shared danger. See what? That we know. That we've always known. Since the day it happened. They talk to us like we're still the same people who flew into Cradlefall trusting them to show up. I thought about that for a long moment, watching the stars move slowly past the viewport, distant and indifferent to everything happening between two species who had once called each other allies. Maybe that's useful, I said. How so? Let them keep believing it. Let them keep thinking we're grateful for scraps of recognition that will fall back into line the moment they ask politely. The longer they believe that, the more room we have to finish what we need to finish without them standing in the way. Daniel studied me for a moment, and something in his expression told me he was seeing the same change in me that I had been quietly seeing in myself for 2 years. The slow hardening of something that used to be softer, the way water becomes ice not all at once but 1 degree at a time, until one day you look down, and the thing that used to flow freely simply does not move anymore. You used to believe in them, he said. It was not quite a question. I used to believe in a lot of things, I said. We sat in silence after that, and I let my mind drift back, briefly, to the woman I had been before Cradlefall, the captain who had eaten food in Varathi kitchens, and learned their language, and trusted gravity to hold. That woman would not have recognized the strategy I was now quietly building in the spaces between official meetings, the long, patient work of positioning humanity's fleets, resources, and leverage exactly where they needed to be, for a reckoning that had not yet been announced, but that I had been planning, in careful pieces, since the night I stood at that memorial wall. The war ground on for another 8 months after Greywatch fell. Humanity's fleets grew larger, sharper, more capable with every battle, built not on Varathi technology handed down as charity, but on human ingenuity, sharpened by necessity, and grief in equal measure. We stopped asking the Coalition for permission to use tactics they once called unthinkable, because we had learned, in the bluntest way possible, that the things they called unthinkable were simply the things they were not willing to pay the cost for themselves. I traveled to 3 different fleet shipyards during those months, watching the new vessels take shape, ships built entirely on human design, faster and harder to track than anything the Varathi had ever shared with us. At one shipyard, a young engineer named Felix walked me through a new class of fighter craft, his hands moving over the schematics with the kind of pride that only comes from building something with your own knowledge, rather than borrowing someone else's. This design wasn't theirs, he said, meaning the Varathi, though he did not say their name directly, the way none of us said their name directly anymore unless we had to. Every piece of it is ours. I understood why that mattered to him, because it mattered to me too. For 3 years of war, humanity had fought with borrowed weapons and borrowed strategy, always one step behind the senior species who claimed to be teaching us. Now, in the wreckage of that broken teaching, we had built something entirely our own, sharper for the absence of their guidance rather than weaker. The Korvath fell, eventually, not because the Coalition finished the job it started, but because humanity finished it for them, fleet by fleet, system by system, in a campaign that the history records would later credit almost entirely to human command and human sacrifice. I remember the exact moment the final Korvath command ship surrendered, because I was there, standing on the bridge of my flagship, watching the enemy banner come down on the tactical display, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not joy, not relief. A door, opening. The war that the Varathi had abandoned us inside of was finally over, won by the species they had been willing to sacrifice without a second thought. And now, for the first time since that long silence at Cradlefall, the balance of power between humanity and the Coalition had shifted entirely into our hands. Before the celebration reached me, I received a private call from Caleb, his face filling my screen from the bridge of the long memory, parked close enough that I could see the lights of his ship through my own viewport. You felt it too, he said, not a question. Felt what? Nothing. When the banner came down, I expected to feel something, and there was nothing there. I understood exactly what he meant, because the same emptiness had settled into me at the same moment, the absence of triumph where triumph should have lived. Maybe it comes later, I said, though I did not fully believe it. Maybe, he said, and then, after a pause that carried more weight than the words that followed it, do you remember the names? On the first wall? At Cradlefall? I remember all of them. I still say them sometimes, before I sleep. I don't know why I started doing it. I just couldn't stop once I had. I had not known that about him, in 2 years of fighting beside him, and the admission landed somewhere soft in me, a place I had thought was fully closed off by then. How many can you still say? I asked. All 403, he said. Every name. Neither of us spoke for a long moment after that, the silence between our two ships heavier than any silence Cradlefall had ever produced, because this silence was full of remembering rather than empty of help. "What do we do with the victory, Mira?" he finally asked, using my given name, something he rarely did anymore, a small crack in the careful formality we had both built around ourselves over years of command. "We make sure it means something," I said. "We make sure 403 names and every name added after them bought us something more permanent than an apology we will never receive." He nodded slowly, and I could see in his face that he was thinking the same thing I had been thinking for months, turning the same question over in his mind during all those long nights of silent repair work and patient strategy. "The council won't like what's coming," he said. "No," I agreed. "They won't." "Good," he said, and ended the call before I could respond, leaving me alone with the weight of that single word, "good," sitting in the quiet of my own bridge. Word of the surrender spread through the fleet within minutes, and I walked the corridors of my ship afterward, watching the celebration that broke out among crew who had spent years fighting a war they were never meant to win alone. Lily found me near the observation deck, her face lit with an exhaustion that had finally found somewhere to set itself down. "We did it," she said, and there was disbelief in her voice, the kind that comes after you have stopped expecting an ending to actually arrive. "We did," I agreed. "What happens to them now?" she asked, and she did not need to clarify who she meant. I looked out at the stars, at the quiet aftermath of a war that had cost humanity more than any single number could properly hold, and I thought about Elwyn's voice, warm and practiced, asking about coordination as if 4 years of abandonment could be smoothed over with the right choice of words. "Now," I said, "we decide what they owe us." Elwyn called again, within hours of the surrender, her voice warmer than ever, full of congratulations and careful talk about the future of the Alliance, about rebuilding, about moving forward together as partners who had endured a difficult war side by side. I listened to every word of it, polite and unreadable, the way I had learned to be. And when she finished speaking, I told her, in a voice that gave away nothing of the years of patience that had brought me to this exact moment, that humanity would be sending a delegation to the Coalition Council within the month, to discuss the terms of what came next. She thanked me for my flexibility, and ended the call still smiling, still believing, as far as I could tell, that the species she was speaking to was the same grateful junior partner it had been before Cradlefall. She was wrong, and within a month, she would understand exactly how wrong she had been. The Coalition Council chamber had not changed in 4 years, and that fact alone told me everything I needed to know about the people who governed it. Tall windows looked out over a garden world the Varathi called Meridian Hall, a planet of soft light and careful architecture, untouched by a single Korvath weapon during the entire war, because the Varathi had built their home far behind the lines they expected humanity to hold for them. I walked into that chamber with 11 members of my delegation behind me, and for the first time in 4 years, I was not the supplicant entering a room of senior species. I was the commander of the fleet that had ended a war the Coalition could not finish without us. The chamber held representatives from 6 species, but only one mattered for what was coming. Elwyn Sereth sat at the center of the long curved table, flanked by an elder named Doran Vell, whose presence I recognized from old briefings as one of the architects of Coalition military strategy, the kind of strategy that had decided, 4 years earlier, exactly which fleets were worth saving and which were not. "Captain Voss," Elwyn said, rising slightly in greeting, her voice carrying the same warmth I remembered from every call before this one. "Welcome. We have prepared an agenda for rebuilding cooperation between our peoples." "I have my own agenda," I said, and set a single data slate on the table between us. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when the balance of power inside them has just visibly shifted, a silence I recognized from years of watching it happen across battlefields and command decks, never before in a chamber like this one. "4 years ago," I began, "at a system your records call Cradlefall, 3 human fleets engaged a Korvath strike force with the expectation that 600 Varathi ships would arrive to support us. Those ships never arrived. 403 of my people died in the 6 hours that followed." Doran Vell shifted in his seat, his expression carefully neutral in the way that I had learned, over years, was a Varathi tell for discomfort rather than calm. "That decision was made under extreme strategic pressure," he said. "The council faced impossible choices regarding the allocation of—" "I am not here to discuss the choice," I said. "I am here to discuss the cost of it." I activated the slate, and a series of figures appeared on the chamber's central display. Numbers I had spent 8 months compiling with a team of analysts who understood exactly what they were building toward. Total human casualties across the war. Total resources humanity had contributed to the coalition's defense without equivalent return. Total instances, documented and verified, where Varathi support had been delayed, redirected, or withheld at critical moments, each one a small cradlefall that the public record had never properly named. 17 separate engagements, I said, where coalition support failed to arrive as promised, always at moments when arriving would have cost the Varathi fleet something significant. In every other engagement, where the cost to your forces was minimal, support arrived precisely on schedule. The silence in the chamber deepened. "This is a serious allegation," said a representative from a smaller species near the end of the table, a being I did not recognize, his voice carrying genuine alarm rather than the practiced calm of the Varathi delegation. "It is not an allegation," I said. "It is a record. I have brought it today not to ask for an apology, because I have stopped expecting one, but to present the terms under which humanity is prepared to continue its relationship with this coalition." Elwyn's warm expression had not changed, but something behind her eyes had. A recalculation happening in real time. The look of a diplomat realizing the conversation she had prepared for was not the conversation taking place. "Terms," she repeated. "Terms," I confirmed, and gestured for Hannah to step forward and begin presenting the documents her team had spent months preparing. The first set of terms concerned reparations, direct and substantial, calculated not as punishment, but as restitution for resources humanity had spent defending territory that primarily benefited coalition worlds far from the actual fighting. The second concerned technology, full and unrestricted access to Varathi shipbuilding knowledge that had been selectively withheld from humanity throughout the war, always offered in pieces, always just enough to keep us dependent rather than capable. The third set of terms was where the room's temperature truly changed. "Humanity requires a permanent seat on the coalition's military command council," Hannah said, her voice even and precise, "with veto authority over any operation involving human forces. We further require access to 3 Varathi shipyards, currently designated for coalition-exclusive use, to be transferred to joint human Varathi administration within 1 standard year. That is not a negotiation," Doran Vell said, his careful neutrality finally cracking into something closer to alarm. "That is an annexation." "It is correction," I said, and let the words sit in the chamber the way silence had once sat over the cradlefall battlefield, heavy and undeniable. "For 4 years your species made decisions about which human lives were worth saving, based on calculations my people were never permitted to see or question. We are simply ensuring that calculation can never be made again without our presence in the room." Elwyn leaned forward slightly, her hands folded with the same composed grace I remembered from every previous meeting, though I could see now, watching her closely, that the composure was costing her more effort than it once had. "Captain Voss," she said, "I understand the pain that Cradlefall caused your people. I was there, in this very chamber, when the decision was made. I argued against it. I had not expected that admission, and for a moment, it landed somewhere unguarded in me, a small crack in the wall I had spent 4 years building." "Then you understand exactly what was lost," I said, "and exactly why this conversation is no longer optional. What you are asking would fundamentally restructure the coalition," she said. "It would place humanity in a position of authority that we have earned," I said, cutting through the sentence before it could soften into something easier to dismiss. "Ask any species in this chamber who finished the war. The coalition could not finish alone. Ask them whose fleets held the line at a dozen battles your own command had already written off as losses. We did not ask for this position, Elwyn. You built the conditions that made it inevitable, the day you decided 403 human lives were an acceptable price for Varathi safety." The chamber sat in silence for a long moment after that, 6 species watching 2 people who represented far more than themselves, watching the slow unraveling of an alliance built on convenience rather than trust. Doran Vell spoke first, his voice quieter than before, the alarm replaced by something more calculating. "And if the council refuses these terms?" I had prepared for this question for months, turning it over during every long night of strategy sessions, weighing the answer against everything Cradlefall had cost, and everything 4 years of careful patience had built. "Then humanity withdraws all military cooperation from the coalition, effective immediately," I said. "We retain our fleets, our technology, our territory, and our independence. The Korvath threat has been ended by human hands. Whatever threats come next, the coalition will face them without us, exactly as we faced Cradlefall without you." A representative from a species I recognized as the Threll, smaller and quieter than the Varathi but present at the table nonetheless, spoke up for the first time, her voice careful but firm. "The Varathi fleet alone cannot maintain coalition security without human support," she said. looking directly at Elwyn rather than at me. This has been understood within the smaller member worlds for over a year. The Council's continued silence on Cradlefall has cost us more than any reparations Captain Voss is requesting today. I had not expected an ally in that chamber, and the moment caught me slightly off guard. A small reminder that the coalition was not a single unified will, but a collection of separate fears and interests, some of which had been waiting, quietly, for someone strong enough to force this exact reckoning. Elwyn's composure finally broke, not into anger, but into something that looked, for just a moment, like genuine grief. "You believe this will make it right," she said, looking at me directly. "The reparations, the seats, the shipyards. You believe taking these things will close what happened at Cradlefall." I held her gaze, and for the first time since walking into that chamber, I let her see something true beneath my carefully composed exterior. A flicker of the question I had been quietly carrying since the night I stood at that memorial wall, the question I had never spoken aloud to anyone. "I don't know if it closes anything," I said. "I know it ensures it cannot happen again. That is the only certainty I am interested in today." The negotiations continued for 6 more hours, moving through each term with a precision my delegation had spent months preparing for, while the Varathi representatives, caught between their own pride and the undeniable mathematics of a coalition that could no longer survive without human strength, slowly conceded ground they would never have conceded 4 years earlier. During a recess in the afternoon, I found myself standing near one of the chamber's tall windows, looking out over the garden world that had never once felt the weight of war, when Doran Vell approached me alone, without the careful formality he had worn at the table. "You fought at Cradlefall," he said. It was not a question. "I commanded the storm rise," I said. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable in a way that reminded me, briefly, of Caleb's own careful neutrality. Two species learning to hide the same kinds of things behind the same kinds of faces. "I voted against the redeployment," he said. "For what that is worth to you, which I understand may be very little." I studied him for a moment, weighing the honesty in his voice against 4 years of practiced Varathi diplomacy, trying to determine whether this admission was strategy or truth. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because in 6 hours, my entire species will have surrendered authority it has held since before your world developed agriculture," he said, "and because some part of me believes you should know that not every Varathi chose what happened to your people. Some of us simply lack the power to stop it." "Lacking power is not the same as lacking responsibility," I said. "No," he agreed. "It is not. I am not asking for absolution, Captain Voss. I am only telling you that the species you are negotiating against today is not as unified in its guilt as your data slate suggests." I did not know what to do with that information, standing in the soft afternoon light of a world that had never burned, and so I said nothing, and after a moment he nodded once, as though my silence had answered something he needed to know, and returned to his seat at the long curved table. The session resumed shortly after, and the conversation moved into the difficult territory of the shipyards, the most contested term among everything Hannah's team had prepared. Elwyn fought hardest on this point, her composure returning in flashes of genuine resistance that told me, more clearly than anything else that day, exactly where the true weight of Varathi pride had settled. "These shipyards represent 4 centuries of Varathi craftsmanship," she said. "Generations of work, passed down through families who have built nothing else for longer than your species has existed in space. You are asking us to hand this inheritance to a people who learned shipbuilding from us only 4 years ago." "We learned shipbuilding from you in pieces," I said, "exactly as much as you judged safe to give a species you intended to keep dependent. The ships that ended this war were not built from Varathi blueprints, Elwyn. They were built by human engineers who stopped waiting for permission to innovate." A murmur moved through the chamber at that, quiet but unmistakable, and I watched several of the smaller species exchange glances that told me this particular truth had not been news to anyone in that room except, perhaps, the Varathi delegation itself. "The shipyards remain a sticking point," Doran Vell said, attempting to redirect the conversation toward something more manageable. "Perhaps a phase transfer, over a period of years rather than 1 year," I said. "That term does not move." The negotiation held there for nearly 2 hours, both sides refusing to soften, until the Threll representative spoke again, her quiet voice carrying more weight in that moment than it had any right to, given the relative smallness of her species within the coalition's hierarchy. "The Council should remember," she said, "that human forces currently control the only fleet capable of enforcing whatever agreement we reach today. Continued delay does not strengthen the Varathi position. It only postpones an outcome that has already been decided by the realities outside this chamber." Elwyn looked at her for a long moment, something complicated passing behind her composed expression, and then, finally, she nodded. 1 year, she said quietly, and something in the chamber shifted permanently with those 2 words. A 4-century inheritance changing hands not through conquest, but through the simple, undeniable mathematics of who held the power to walk away. By the end of that first day, no final agreement had been signed, but something had shifted permanently in that chamber, a balance of power that would never again rest entirely in Varathi hands. I walked out into the soft evening light of Meridian Hall, with my delegation around me, and Caleb fell into step beside me, his expression unreadable in the particular way that had become his signature since Cradlefall. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly. I thought about Elwyn's question in the chamber, the one that had landed somewhere I had not expected, somewhere underneath the armor I had spent 4 years constructing. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "Ask me again when we've taken everything they have." Caleb studied me for a long moment, and something passed across his face that I would not fully understand until much later, a kind of caution I did not yet recognize as warning. "And if taking everything doesn't feel the way you expect it to?" he asked. We walked in silence for a while after that, past gardens that had never known the sound of weapons fire, past Varathi citizens who watched our delegation pass with expressions I could not fully read, somewhere between fear and curiosity and a kind of resentment that I suspected would only grow in the months ahead. "Doran Vell told me he voted against the redeployment," I said finally. "Against Cradlefall. Do you believe him?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know if it matters whether I believe him. The decision was still made. The result was still the same, 403 names. "But it matters to you," Caleb said, "or you wouldn't be telling me about it." I considered that for a long moment, watching the last light fade over a world built entirely on the comfort of distance from every war it had ever profited from. "I keep waiting to feel something solid," I said. "Some kind of certainty that everything we're doing is simply correction, simply justice, nothing more complicated than that. And every time I get close to that certainty, something happens that makes the ground feel less steady than I want it to." Caleb did not answer right away, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him since the night he told me he still said all 403 names before sleeping. "Maybe that unsteadiness is the only honest thing left in any of this," he said. "Maybe the moment it stops feeling complicated is the moment we should start worrying about what we've become." I did not have an answer for him that evening, walking away from a chamber where I had just begun, formally and permanently, the long process of making the coalition pay for every silence they had ever chosen over us. I only had the same cold certainty I had carried since that night at the memorial wall, the promise I had made to myself and to Owen, and to every name on that growing list of the dead. We would remember exactly who did not come, and we were no longer simply waiting to make them understand what that absence cost. We had begun, finally, to collect the debt. 6 months after the negotiations at Meridian Hall, I stood on the surface of a Varathi colony called Anseth, watching a transfer ceremony I had personally authorized, and I felt the first real crack form in the certainty I had carried since Cradlefall. The agreement had been signed 3 months earlier, every term I demanded written into law, witnessed by all 6 coalition species in a formal session that history would remember, as the moment humanity stopped asking for a seat at the table, and started building its own table instead. Reparations had been paid, technology had been transferred. The first of 3 shipyards now operated under joint human Varathi administration, with human oversight holding final authority on every major decision. Anseth was the second colony scheduled for transition, a quiet agricultural world that had supplied food to Varathi military forces throughout the war, never touched by direct combat, its population entirely unprepared for what was now arriving in their sky. I had come personally because Hannah's intelligence reports suggested local resistance to the transition, and I wanted to see the situation directly rather than trust it to a report filtered through layers of administration. What I found, standing in the colony's central square as human administrators began the formal transfer of governance authority, was a crowd of Varathi civilians watching in silence, the same kind of silence I remembered from the 6 hours at Cradlefall, except this time, the silence belonged to people who had done nothing themselves, who had only inherited the consequences of choices made by a council they had never personally controlled. An elderly Varathi woman stood near the front of the crowd, her hands folded in front of her in a posture I recognized from years of working alongside Varathi officers, a posture of formal respect that looked, in this context, uncomfortably close to surrender. "You are the one they call Voss," she said, as I passed near her position. It was not quite a question. "I am," I said. "My grandson died at a battle called Greywatch," she said. "Fighting alongside your people. He believed in the alliance until the day he died believing in it. I stopped walking, something in her voice carrying a weight I had not prepared myself for, a grief that belonged entirely to her own loss rather than to anything I could file away as Varathi guilt-deserving correction. "I am sorry for your loss," I said, and meant it, though the words felt smaller than the moment required. "Are you?" she asked, not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted curiosity that was somehow harder to absorb than anger would have been. "Because the people standing in my town square today, taking authority over land my family has farmed for 6 generations, do not look like people who are sorry. They look like people collecting a debt my grandson already paid with his own life." I did not have an answer for her, and the absence of an answer sat heavy in my chest as I continued through the square, watching human administrators move through buildings that had stood for centuries, watching Varathi families pack belongings into transport vehicles bound for designated resettlement zones, a process my own delegation had approved as fair and necessary 3 months earlier, in a chamber far away from the actual faces now living inside that approval. That evening, I received a call from a man named Owen, the same engineer who had found me at the memorial wall 4 years earlier, now serving as a senior administrator within the new joint government structure overseeing the colonial transitions. "You should see the numbers coming out of Anseth," he said, his voice carrying a tension I had not heard from him in years. "Tell me," I said. "We're displacing 11,000 people in this transition alone," he said. "Most of them never fought in the war. Most of them were farmers, teachers, children who weren't even born when Cradlefall happened. We're taking their homes and calling it reparations." I sat with that number for a long moment, 11,000, turning it over against the 403 names I had carried since that first memorial wall, trying to find the place where the mathematics of justice was supposed to balance these two figures against each other, and finding instead that no equation I built ever quite resolved itself cleanly. "The council approved this transition," I said, though even as I said it, the words felt thinner than they once would have. "The council approved a policy," Owen said. "I'm standing in the middle of what that policy actually looks like. Mira, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it, instead of giving me the version you give the press." "Ask," I said. "Where does it end?" The question landed somewhere I had been avoiding for months, a place I had kept carefully locked behind the steady work of negotiation and administration, the same place Caleb's question had touched 6 months earlier, in the gardens of Meridian Hall. "I don't know," I admitted, the honesty costing me something to give. "That frightens me," Owen said, "because I remember exactly what Cradlefall taught you. I remember you telling me, standing right there at that wall, that we would make them understand what their absence cost. I don't think anyone back then imagined it would look like an old woman, watching her family's farm get reassigned to people who don't even know her name." I ended that call without a clean resolution, because there was no clean resolution to offer him, and I spent the following weeks watching the transitions continue across 2 more colonies, watching the careful machinery of justice I had built at Meridian Hall produce results that grew increasingly difficult to separate from the very pattern I had once sworn to correct. It was during a visit to the 3rd shipyard, now fully under joint administration, that I encountered Lily again, no longer simply a tactical commander, but now overseeing security operations across the transition territories, a role that had hardened something in her that I recognized, uncomfortably, as a mirror of my own transformation. I watched her direct a security detail removing a group of Varathi shipyard workers who had refused to vacate their quarters during a scheduled transition, her voice flat and final in a way that reminded me, with sudden and unwelcome clarity, of the cold mathematics the Varathi Council had once used to decide which human fleets were worth the cost of saving. "They had 30 days' notice," she said to me afterward, anticipating the question in my expression before I asked it. "We followed every protocol." "I'm not questioning the protocol," I said. "Then what are you questioning?" I looked at her for a long moment, this young officer who had once shaken at her console during the worst 6 hours of my life, now standing fully composed, while families were removed from homes they had lived in for generations, and I felt the rupture I had been holding back for months finally break through the careful surface I had built around it. "I'm questioning whether we became exactly what we promised ourselves we would never become," I said quietly. Lily's expression flickered, something uncertain passing behind her professional composure, and for a moment I saw the frightened young weapons officer still living somewhere beneath the hardened commander she had grown into. "They left us to die," she said, her voice carrying less certainty than her words intended. 403 people, Captain. I watched the names go up on that wall, same as you did." "I know," I said. "I have never once forgotten that number. But I am standing in a shipyard today watching us remove people who had nothing to do with that decision from homes they built with their own hands, and I cannot find the place anymore where remembering Cradlefall justifies what is happening in front of me. We stood there together in silence, two officers who had built their entire understanding of justice on the wreckage of a single terrible day, neither of us able to offer the other any comfortable answer. 3 days after my conversation with Lily, I called an emergency session with my own command council, the small group of human officers who had grown alongside me through every stage of the war and everything that followed it. Hannah was there, her intelligence reports now covering not just Varathi movements but the growing unrest within the transitioned colonies. Daniel attended as well, no longer simply a communications officer but a senior voice in shaping how humanity presented its actions to the wider galaxy. I want a full review of the transition protocols, I said, once everyone had settled into the small conference room that had seen so many of our most difficult decisions over the years. Every colony, every displacement, I want to understand exactly what we have built before we continue building more of it. Hannah exchanged a glance with Daniel before responding, and something in that brief exchange told me they had been expecting this conversation for longer than I had realized. We've had concerns building internally for months, Hannah admitted. Reports from administrators on the ground, complaints about scope, about timeline, about whether the reparations framework accounts for civilian impact the way it should. Why wasn't I told? I asked, though even as the question left my mouth, I understood the answer before anyone spoke it aloud. Because you built this framework standing at a memorial wall 4 years ago, Daniel said, his voice careful but direct, the same precision he had carried since the night he sat beside me on a darkened bridge, searching for the moment a lie had been written. Nobody wanted to be the person who told you it might be producing something you wouldn't recognize as justice anymore. The honesty of that statement landed harder than any criticism could have, because it carried no anger, only the simple weight of people who had watched me build something powerful enough that even they had grown hesitant to question its direction. Show me everything, I said. All of it. I don't care how uncomfortable the numbers are. What followed was 3 full days of review, working through reports from every transitioned colony, every shipyard, every reparations payment extracted from Varathi resources that had once belonged to families with no connection to the Council's decisions at Cradlefall. I read accounts of elderly Varathi citizens relocated from homes they had lived in for generations. I read reports of children separated from schools, of farmers separated from land that had fed their communities for centuries, of skilled workers stripped of positions they had held their entire careers, replaced by human administrators who often lacked the specific knowledge those positions required. I also read, with a complexity that refused to simplify itself no matter how long I sat with it, the other side of the ledger. Reports of the 403 names from Cradlefall, joined now by thousands more across every battle the Coalition had abandoned humanity inside of. Reports of resources extracted from human worlds throughout the war, technology withheld, supply lines redirected, all of it real, all of it justifying something, even if I was no longer certain it justified everything currently being built in its name. On the 3rd night of that review, Caleb joined me in the conference room, finding me alone with stacks of data slates spread across the table, the weight of every report settling into a place that no longer felt like the cold certainty I had carried for years. You look the way you looked after Cradlefall, he said, sitting down across from me without being invited, the same familiarity that had carried us through everything since that first long silence. I keep thinking about the woman at Anseth, I said, the one whose grandson died at Greywatch fighting beside us. She asked me if I was actually sorry, and I told her yes, and standing there I believed it. But I don't know if belief is enough anymore, Caleb. I don't know if sorrow that doesn't change anything is just another kind of lie. He was quiet for a long moment, turning that thought over the way he turned over everything difficult, slowly, and without rushing toward an easy resolution. Maybe the question isn't whether to stop, he finally said. Maybe it's whether you can build something that remembers both ledgers at once. The 403 names, and the 11,000 people standing in a town square watching their lives get reassigned. Is that even possible? I asked. Or am I just looking for a way to feel better about something that can't actually be balanced? Caleb did not answer that question, and I understood, watching his face in the dim light of that conference room, that he did not have an answer to give me, because the question itself did not yet have a clean answer anywhere in the galaxy. Not in coalition law, not in human strategy, not in 4 years of careful planning built from the wreckage of a single terrible day. That night, alone in my quarters aboard my flagship, I found myself doing something I had not done in years. I pulled up the original memorial record from Cradlefall, scrolling slowly through all 403 names, reading each one the way Caleb had once told me he did every night before sleeping. I did not find the certainty I was searching for. I found instead a different kind of weight settling into the same place where the cold thing had first appeared 4 years earlier. Not anger anymore, not the closed door I had carried since that night at the memorial wall, but something more complicated, something that recognized, for the first time, that the door I had closed against further betrayal might also have closed against something I needed to keep open. I did not share this doubt with anyone beyond Caleb, who received it the way he received most difficult truths, with quiet acknowledgement rather than easy comfort. "You're asking the right question too late to stop what's already moving," he said, when I finally told him what I had been carrying since Anseth. "The transitions won't pause because you've started doubting them." "I know," I said. "Does that change what you're going to do next?" I did not have an answer for him that night, and the rupture I had felt standing in that shipyard did not resolve itself. Not that night, not in the weeks that followed, sitting instead in the same place where Cradlefall's silence had once lived, unexplained and unexamined, waiting for whatever would come next to finally force it into the open. 1 year after I stood in the colony square at Anseth listening to a grandmother's grief, I returned to the Coalition Council chamber at Meridian Hall for what the official records would call the final accounting, the formal closing session marking the completion of every term negotiated in the months following the Korvath surrender. The chamber looked different this time, not because the architecture had changed, but because the people inside it had. Doran Vell was gone, retired from council service sometime during the previous year, replaced by a younger Varathi representative, who carried none of the old guard's practiced composure. Elwyn remained, though something in her posture had shifted permanently since our first negotiation, the warmth in her voice worn thinner by 12 months of watching her species absorb terms she had once called annexation. I walked into that chamber not as the commander who had once set a single data slate on the table and changed the balance of power between two species, but as something more complicated, a woman who had spent the previous year working quietly to soften certain elements of the very framework she had built, redirecting some reparations toward direct support for displaced Varathi civilians, slowing the pace of colonial transitions, insisting on review processes that gave families more than 30 days to prepare for upheaval that would reshape generations. It had not been an easy year. My own command council had been divided on every adjustment I proposed, some arguing that softening the terms dishonored the dead, others arguing that the original framework had already drifted too far from anything resembling justice. Lily had resigned her security command 3 months earlier, unable to reconcile what the role required of her with what she had begun to understand about the people she was removing from their homes. Hannah had stayed, though her reports grew increasingly focused on civilian impact rather than strategic advantage, a shift in priority that told me, without her ever saying it directly, that she had been carrying the same doubt I carried. Caleb sat beside me now during council sessions, having accepted a formal advisory role after months of quiet conversations that helped me find whatever uneasy balance I had managed to build between the ledger of Cradlefall and the ledger of everything that came after it. "The Council recognizes the completion of all reparation terms negotiated under the Meridian Accord," the new Varathi representative said, his voice formal and careful in the particular way of someone new to a role he had not chosen under comfortable circumstances, "including the transfer of 3 shipyards to joint administration, the establishment of permanent human representation on the Military Command Council, and the full settlement of resource reparations as outlined in the original agreement." I listened to the formal language, the careful legal phrasing that smoothed 4 years of grief and 3 years of complicated reckoning into something that sounded, in this chamber, almost simple. "Captain Voss," Elwyn said, once the formal recitation finished, "would you like to address the council before this session closes?" I stood, looking out at the 6 species gathered in that chamber, the same chamber where I had once placed a single data slate on the table and watched the careful composure of an entire civilization begin to crack under the weight of evidence it could no longer dismiss. 3 years ago, I said, I stood in this room and told you that we were not here to ask for an apology, because I had stopped expecting one. I want to revise that statement today. The chamber went quiet, the particular silence I had come to recognize over years of watching rooms shift beneath the weight of difficult truths. I have spent the past year watching the consequences of the terms I demanded in this chamber, I continued. I have stood in a colony square and listened to a grandmother ask whether the people taking authority over her family's land were actually sorry for what happened, or whether they were simply collecting a debt that had already been paid in full by people who never made the original decision. I did not have a good answer for her then. I am not certain I have one now. Elwyn's expression carried something complicated, watching me speak words that contradicted, at least partially, the very framework she had spent a year resenting and adjusting to in equal measure. What I do know, I said, is that the 403 names from Cradlefall were real. And the silence that killed them was a choice, made by people in positions of comfort who decided human lives were a price worth paying for Varathi safety. That truth does not become less true because the reparations built to address it produced consequences I did not fully anticipate. I paused, looking around the chamber at faces from 6 different species, each one carrying their own complicated relationship to everything that had happened since that first long silence at Cradlefall. I also know, I continued, that 11,000 people were displaced from a single colony in a transition I personally authorized, most of them with no connection to the decisions that caused this reckoning in the first place. I know that somewhere in the space between those two truths, I built something that I am still uncertain how to name. Justice, perhaps, or perhaps simply a different shape of the same harm, carried by different hands. The young Varathi representative shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and I noticed Elwyn watching me with an expression I had not seen from her before, something closer to recognition than diplomacy. I am not here today to undo what has been built, I said. The shipyards remain under joint administration. The reparations stand. Humanity's seat on this council remains permanent, and it should remain permanent, because the conditions that created Cradlefall must never be allowed to exist again without our presence to prevent them. But I am asking this council, formally, to join humanity in building something neither of our species has fully managed alone, a framework that remembers the cost of betrayal without becoming, in its correction, an echo of the very thing it was built to answer. Silence held the chamber for a long moment after I finished speaking, 6 species processing words that offered no clean resolution, no simple verdict on whether the previous 3 years had been justice or excess, correction, or a different kind of wound wearing more comfortable clothing. Elwyn rose slowly from her seat, and for the first time since I had known her, the careful diplomatic warmth in her voice was gone entirely, replaced by something rawer. I argued against the redeployment at Cradlefall, she said, and I have spent 4 years living with the knowledge that my argument failed to save 403 people. I have also spent the past year watching my own people lose homes, positions, and dignity, through a process my council agreed to under circumstances I am not certain we fully understood at the time. I do not know which failure weighs heavier, Captain Voss. I suspect I will not know for the remainder of my life. She looked at me directly, and for a moment the distance between us, built across years of careful diplomacy and harder negotiation, felt smaller than it had at any point since that first long silence over Cradlefall. Perhaps that uncertainty is the only honest place either of our species can stand right now, she said. I did not have a response that improved on her words, and so I let them sit in the chamber unanswered, the way Caleb had once told me certain ruptures were meant to sit, unresolved and unexplained, carrying their own weight without needing language to soften them. The formal session closed shortly after. The Meridian Accord entered permanently into Coalition record, marking the end of the reckoning I had begun 3 years earlier standing in this same chamber with nothing but a data slate and 4 years of carefully gathered grief. Before leaving the building, I stopped by a smaller meeting room where Hannah and Daniel were finishing the last administrative work of the closing session, gathering reports and signatures that would formally archive everything the Meridian Accord had built across 3 difficult years. "It's done," Hannah said, looking up as I entered, exhaustion and something close to relief mixing in her expression. "It's done," I agreed, though the words felt heavier in my mouth than victory usually did. Daniel set down the slate he had been reviewing and studied me for a moment, with the same careful attention he had once given a recorded message about strategic redeployment, searching for whatever truth lived beneath the surface of what I was saying. "You don't look like someone who just finished what they set out to do 4 years ago," he said. "I don't feel like someone who finished it either," I admitted. Hannah leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window and the soft evening light beyond it, the same light that had never once carried the weight of war to this particular world. "I keep thinking about the numbers," she said quietly. "Not the reparations, not the shipyards, the actual people. 11,000 displaced from Anseth alone, and that was only the first colony. I built those projections myself, back when I was still certain the framework was simply correction. I don't know when I stopped being certain, I just know I am not anymore." "None of us are," Daniel said. "I don't think that's a failure, Mira. I think that might be the only proof we haven't become something unrecognizable. The moment doubt stops visiting you is the moment you should be afraid of what you've built." I thought about Caleb saying something similar to me once, in the gardens of Meridian Hall a year earlier, the same warning dressed in slightly different words, and I wondered, not for the first time, whether the people who had stayed closest to me throughout this entire reckoning had been quietly trying to save me from myself the entire time, in the only way any of them knew how, through honesty offered carefully and without judgment. "What happens to the framework now?" I asked. "Now that the formal accord is closed?" The adjustments you made stay in place, Hannah said. The review processes, the extended timelines, the civilian support programs. They're written into permanent coalition law now, alongside everything else. Whatever this becomes going forward, it won't be exactly what it was in the first year, and it won't be exactly what either of us originally imagined either. I considered that, the strange shape of a legacy built not from a single clean vision but from years of correction layered over correction, grief answered by reckoning answered, eventually, by doubt that refused to simply disappear once it arrived. Is that enough? I asked, not entirely certain who I was asking, Hannah, Daniel, or simply the quiet room itself. I don't know if enough is a question that has an answer, Daniel said. I think it might just be a question you keep asking, for as long as you're the kind of person willing to keep asking it. The day you stop is probably the day to actually worry. I left them there finishing the last of the administrative work, walking out into the evening light alone this time, having sent the rest of my delegation ahead, needing a moment without the careful performance of command, before facing whatever came next. I found the elderly Varathi woman from Anseth waiting near the chamber entrance, the same grandmother whose grandson had died at Greywatch, whose family farm had been reassigned during the transition I authorized. I had arranged, quietly, for her family's land to be among the first returned under the adjusted framework, though I had never told her this directly, never sought the kind of credit that would have made the gesture about my own need for resolution, rather than her actual loss. Captain Voss, she said, the same formal posture from our first meeting, though something in her expression had softened slightly over the intervening months. I heard your family's land was returned, I said. It was, she confirmed. I do not know if I should thank you, or whether thanking you simply completes a circle that should never have needed to exist in the first place. I considered her words for a long moment, standing together in the fading light of a world that had never burned, two people carrying different pieces of the same impossible ledger. I don't know either, I said honestly. She studied me for a moment, and something passed across her face that I recognized, with a small and unexpected ache, as a version of the same uncertainty I had been carrying since the night I first stood at a memorial wall and made myself a promise I no longer knew how fully to measure against what it had become. My grandson believed in your alliance until the day he died, she said. I have spent 4 years trying to decide whether that belief was foolish, or whether it was simply hope, offered honestly, betrayed by people who never deserved it on either side of this conflict. Which have you decided? I asked. I haven't, she said. I suspect I never fully will. She left me standing there in the quiet evening air, and I did not follow her, understanding that some conversations end not with resolution, but with the simple acknowledgement that resolution was never actually available to begin with. I thought, standing alone in that fading light, about the woman I had been before Cradlefall, the captain who believed in gravity holding allies in place, and the woman I had become across 4 years of grief, strategy, reckoning, and doubt. Someone who had taken everything the Varathi had, exactly as I once promised myself I would, and who still did not know, standing in the very chamber where that promise had been fulfilled, whether what I had built was justice earned, or simply the same old wound, passed forward into new and unfamiliar hands. I thought about Owen, the young engineer with the burn across his face, who had asked me what happens now, standing at a memorial wall before either of us understood the years that question would eventually demand of us both. I thought about Lily, who had walked away from her command, rather than continue removing families from homes she could no longer convince herself deserved to be taken. I thought about Caleb, still saying 403 names some nights before sleeping, carrying the original grief forward, even as he helped me question everything that grief had eventually built. I thought too about the Korvath War itself, already fading into history the way all wars eventually do, reduced in most accounts to dates and casualty figures, the long silence at Cradlefall becoming, for most of the galaxy, a single line in a longer story, rather than the 6 hours that had reshaped an entire species' understanding of trust. I wondered whether anyone reading that history decades from now would understand the actual weight of what had happened in this chamber. The slow turning of grief into leverage, leverage into correction, correction into something that had cost both species more than either had fully accounted for at the start. A transport ship passed overhead, carrying administrators back toward the shipyards that now operated under joint authority. Ordinary work continuing in the aftermath of a reckoning that history would likely simplify into something far cleaner than it had actually been to live through. I watched its lights fade into the darkening sky, and I found myself thinking, unexpectedly, of the 403 names again, not as a debt anymore, not as a promise still waiting to be fulfilled, but simply as people, individual and irreplaceable, whose loss had set into motion consequences far larger than any of them could have imagined in their final 6 hours aboard ships that never received the help they were promised. I did not have an answer that evening, and I have never fully found one since. Perhaps that absence of certainty is the only honest thing I have left to offer anyone who asks what humanity became in the years after Cradlefall, after we took everything the Varathi had, after the long silence that started this entire reckoning finally gave way to a different kind of silence, one neither victory nor apology had ever quite managed to fill. I leave that question where Caleb once told me certain ruptures belong, unresolved, unexplained, carried forward by whoever comes after me, to decide for themselves what the answer should have been.